Hello, book friend. See the smile on my face? This is because I get to chat for 13 minutes or so about Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. One of my favorite Dickens novels that I've read several times, originally published back in 1857 after being serialized over a couple of years previous to that. But Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens, this particular edition that I read is a 2019 Audible edition, which was narrated by Juliet Stevenson. And what an amazing job she did on narrating this story. Charles Dickens novels, are known for having multiple characters. I believe I've counted there's 36 characters that speak during the course of this novel, and a few others actually that are sort of more minor, but all 36 of those characters were so unique that I would have thought in a way that there were multiple people narrating the book, because she put such character into each of these literary characters. So yeah, Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. I did mention I've read this several times. I did want to reread it again because it'd been a while, and I'd never chatted a work by Charles Dickens on my channel, and I just realized that just had to change. And since this is one of my favorites, I decided to go ahead and chat this one. So this chat's going to be a spoiler-free chat. I am planning to do maybe at least one more video about Little Dorrit, just to dive deeper into some sort of the issues and themes that a few of the characters really, I think, exhibit really, really well. But for the purposes of this chat, I will not disclose anything about the story that I think that would detract from a first-time reader. This is pretty epic. The narrated version, the Audible version, was about 40 hours. So I've both read this in book form. I've listened to another different audio edition, and then this edition as well. And takes a bit. It's a significant time investment, whichever sort of avenue you take to approach this novel. But to me, it's well worth the time invested in the payoff of just sheer enjoyment. So what it's about, there is some mystery to it, so I'm not going to give that away. But what it's generally about is the story opens in Marseille in France, in a prison, and there is a couple of prisoners there having this conversation. One is known as Rigaud, and he is in there for, I guess, he's accused of murder. And then his cellmate is Cavaletto. So those two are in prison when we start out in Marseille. And then there's this group of English people they've been in quarantine, and they're just being released in quarantine, but they've been in quarantine together for several weeks, so they've gotten to know each other. And this includes Arthur Clennam, who ends up being one of the main characters of the book, as well as Mr. and Mrs. Meagles, and their daughter, Pet, who is a sort of a spoiled, not really, I wouldn't say spoiled daughter, but she is doted upon, and she is known as Pet. And then their daughter Pet has a sort of a maid or a companion who is considered by the Meagles really to be a member of their family, and they call her Tattycoram. So that group, and then Arthur's there, like I mentioned. Then we also have Miss Wade. So Miss Wade is among these people who have been in quarantine in Marseille, and she sort of stays off to herself. And we come to know that she's had some influence on Tattycoram, which she continues to have throughout most of the novel, and not in a good way. But Miss Wade will explore more maybe in the next chat that I do about this book, a little more in depth about her personality and sort of the bitterness that has overcome her in her life. But then, so the English travelers, so they make their way actually eventually back to England. And then the main sort of central family is the Dorrit family. They are actually in a debtor's prison. The father's name is William Dorrit, and he has 3 children, a son who's known as Tip, and then a daughter, Fanny, and then his youngest daughter, Little Dorrit, Amy Dorrit, everyone calls her Little Dorrit. She's kind of known as the child of the Marshalsea because the Dorrit family were put into this debtor's prison when Mrs. Dorrit, who actually died, I guess shortly after childbirth, she dies. So Little Dorrit was basically born and raised in the debtor's prison. By the time the story opens, I think Little Dorrit's like 22 or something. So that family's been in the prison for quite a number of years, for a couple of decades. It's more than 2 decades at this point. And William Dorrit is known as the father of the Marshalsea, and he really takes this position sort of as a status symbol, right, among the other debtors that are in this prison. But anyway, I thought it would be just the story actually revolves around this Dorrit family. They are in this debtor's prison, but the story really revolves, I think, the main theme of the story is poverty in a couple of different forms. The poverty meaning material wealth, the poverty in material wealth, and then the poverty of character. So all of the characters that participate in this story really, I think, illustrate this really well. They either have riches in character, and sometimes they have riches in character, but poverty in material wealth. Sometimes they have poverty of material wealth and also poverty of riches, and then sometimes they have wealth of riches, like material wealth, but lack in in character, and so they have poverty of character. So I think that's kind of like the central sort of theme that's running through the whole story. Arthur Clennam, though, who we met back in Marseille, he's returning from a long life abroad, really. He went abroad about 20 years ago. He's about 40 years old now. And he's returning to England because his father has passed away. They have been in business in China. And so he's returning to London. He has his mother lives there, and in this kind of creepy old house, she has a couple of servants, Mr. Flintwinch, and his wife, whose name is Afri, and they live under these conditions with Mrs. Clennam is bound into one room. She's an invalid, and she never leaves this room. She hasn't left this room up in her bedroom in like 15 years. She's just secluded there, but she still carries on this business. There's some big mystery going on here. We know right away. Well, for one, Afri, who is the original gaslighting. So, we might think gaslighting is a relatively new idea. Gaslighting, Afri, her husband, she is classic gaslight. As far as she thinks she sees these things, and her husband tells her she's dreaming, and she thinks she hears all these things, and so she lives kind of in terror all the time. But her husband has convinced her that it's all a dream, that she's just dreamed these things that she's seen and whatnot. She actually believes him. So yeah, that's that sort of family. Then we have the Dorrits. Mentioned them living in the prison. The prison itself, the turnkey of the prison, it changes a couple of times because they've been in the prison so long, but during the main portion of the story, the main turnkey is Mr. Chivery, and then he has Mrs. Chivery there, who runs a little shop, and then his son also works as kind of like the assistant turnkey, and he's known as young John Chivery. And so they kind of I guess oversee the prison. The debtor's prison, I think, is really interesting because it's 19th century London, and so people could get sent to these debtor's prisons, and then you couldn't work. You can't leave the prison, but you had to stay there until your debt got paid off. And so if you can't work and you had no one providing money to pay off your debt, you just stayed in the prison, which is how William Dorrit stayed in the prison as long as he did. Anyway, there's several other sort of interesting characters. When Arthur returns back to London, he actually meets up with his former fiancée. He had been madly in love with this woman, Flora, and has his mother, who's this kind of really stern, severe, hyper-religious woman, very kind of unpleasant. She had broken them up, actually, and sent him away. That was one of the reasons why he went off to China. Anyway, he meets Florence. Of course, she's completely different now, but she wants to resume the relationship with Arthur. And so that's actually really funny sort of dynamic that they have going on. And then there's also also this sort of in addition to the sort of like social commentary of poverty of character versus poverty of material wealth, and the whole debtors prison system, the class system of the time that Dickens is so famous for being able to illustrate. We also have sort of a critique of the government at the time. There is a government office known as the Circumlocution Office, and their motto is really how not to do it. They sort of operate under the program of how to obstruct anything, any progress. So that's actually pretty funny. And then there's I've already mentioned the Meagleses. Let me just run through so I don't forget anybody important. The Miss Wade. Finching. The Myrtles. Yeah, I wanted to mention Mrs. Myrtle, Mr. and Mrs. Myrtle. Mrs. Myrtle, Mr. Myrtle is sort of the financier of the time that everybody just thinks is a miracle worker and can do no wrong. And of course, as the story progresses, we find out that might not be the case, right? But Mr. Myrtle's extremely rich, extremely successful, and everyone really just hangs on his every word when it comes to financial issues, to their peril. And then Mrs. Myrtle, he has this beautiful wife known as Mrs. Myrtle, who is known through our narrator in the story refers to her as the bosom. She has this very famous bosom that's perfect for wearing, expensive jewelry. And so the bosom features very prominently in the relationship of her son, Edmund Sparkler, who is her son from a previous marriage, and she's kind of trying her best to get him well positioned in society. Of course, she's married to the right guy, Mr. Myrtle, in that case. Anyway, I could spend a lot more time talking about this book, but I don't want to give a lot away about it because there is this big mystery, and I don't want to delve really into what happens. And there's a first part of the book where the Dorrits are in prison. Then there's a second part of the book, and I don't really want to give away who hooks up, who marries who, and what happens. Fortunes changed. Let's just say that. All sorts of fortunes changed for both the better and the worst. And then the great mystery of Mrs. Clennam and Mr. Flintwinch and the gaslighted Affrey all gets resolved by the end. We also have the prisoners that were at the beginning of the story make their way to London as well, and one of them, Mr. Rigaud, who is known in London at that time. He goes by several different aliases, but most of the time in London, everyone refers to him as Mr. Blandois, and so Blandois is working his chaos in London and abroad. The story actually takes place in London, in Twickenham, a little village sort of near London, in St. Bernard, Switzerland, in Marseille, like I've already mentioned, in Calais, in Venice, and in Rome. So our characters definitely get outside of London some in this story, which is a lot of fun. All right, I think I will end this chat with that. I am planning on doing at least one more video delving into a bit more about this idea of poverty and character as it's reflected really in the Dorrit family, but in among some of the other characters as well. And then this sort of attitude of life that Miss Wade has is another topic that I would like to explore a little bit more. So I think this book might have at least 2 more videos just to talk through a bit more of the details and some of these aspects of the characterizations that are in this novel. So I'll leave the chat with that. My next chat is going to be The Phenomenon of Man by Pierre Tielhard de Chardin. I should have a chat on this coming up fairly soon. So until next time, take care. Bye.